Record. All right, we're gonna start. Okay. Imagine a society where the government has the power to decide which opinions are too offensive to be spoken aloud, not just extreme or hateful ideas, but anything that those in power decide cross a line. Now think about that for a second. Who gets to draw that line? Is it politicians, judges, the majority? And what happens when that line inevitably shifts over time? Because history shows us that it always does. Ideas that were once considered dangerous or unacceptable, whether it was civil rights activism, criticism of the government, or even certain religious beliefs, were often suppressed under the justification of protecting society. When we talk about restricting speech, we are not just talking about hate speech. We are talking about the power to decide what ideas are allowed to exist at all. That brings us to today. Should hate speech be protected under the First Amendment? Our thesis is that hate speech, while deeply offensive and harmful, should remain protected under the First Amendment because restricting it would threaten broader free speech rights and democratic principles. As college students, this issue directly affects us. We participate in discussions, debates, and classrooms where ideas are constantly exchanged. Some of those ideas challenge us, some offend us, some we strongly disagree with, but that exchange is what allows us to think critically and engage in a democratic society. Our argument is grounded in constitutional law, Supreme Court rulings, and scholarly research. Today, we will first explain the legal foundation of free speech, then present two arguments for protecting hate speech, and then after that, examine two major counter-arguments about its harms and ethical concerns. Finally, we will explain why, despite those concerns, protections remain necessary.
Free speech must be broadly protected to function at all. Free speech is not just one right among many, it is a foundation that allows all other rights to exist. Without free speech, we cannot criticize the government, we cannot advocate for change, we cannot challenge injustice, and every major social movement in history has relied on the ability to express unpopular or controversial ideas. The First Amendment protects speech broadly, including speech that is offensive, controversial, or deeply unpopular, and that is intentional. Because if speech were only protected when it is acceptable, then it would not need protection at all. The Supreme Court reinforced this in Brandenburg versus Ohio, where it ruled that the speech can only be restricted if it is intended to incite imminent lawless action and is likely to produce that action. That is an extremely high standard, and it exists for a reason. It ensures that speech is not limited based on emotion, discomfort, or disagreement, but only when there's a clear and immediate danger. Now, critics argue that this allows harmful speech to exist, and they're right, it does. But lowering that standard creates a much bigger risk. If we allow the government to restrict speech because it's offensive, then we're giving the power to define what offensive actually means. And that definition itself is not very fixed. What is considered offensive today might not actually be considered necessary tomorrow. And for example, many ideas that are now widely accepted today, such as protests against inequality or criticism of authority, were once labeled as dangerous or unacceptable. So the real issue is not just about hate speech. It's about whether we are willing to trust the government with the power to decide which ideas are allowed to exist. Because once that power exists, it can expand. And history suggests that it often does. This leads directly into the second argument, why protecting hate speech specifically helps prevent that kind of power from growing.
Protecting hate speech limits government power and protects all speech. The strongest argument for protecting hate speech is not about defending the content, but is preventing government overreach. Groups like the American Civil Liberties Union argue that free speech must apply to universities, even the speech we strongly oppose, because once censorship begins, it really stops when it started. At first, restrictions may much target large extreme or widely condemned ideas. That might seem reasonable, in fact. It might even seem necessary. But over time, these reactions tend to expand. Government have historically used speech laws to silence political opposition, minority voices, and activists. What begins as a tool to protect society can quickly become a tool to control it. Think about how easy it is to justify expanding those restrictions. If one type of speech is harmful, why not another? If one group needs protection, why not restrict more speech to ensure that protection? But before long, the scope of censorship goes far beyond its original purpose. Opponents argue that allowing hate speech, given a platform to harmful ideologies, and that concern is valid. But the alternatives to is giving the government the authority to decide which ideas are too dangerous to be expressed. And while authority is far more dangerous because it does not apply to hate speech, but it applies to all speech. Protecting speech, we agree with, is easy. The real test of free speech is whether we're willing to protect speech, and we strongly disagree with. However, even with these arguments, we cannot ignore the real harms that hate speech causes.
Hate speech creates real harm that extends beyond words. Hate speech is not just offensive, it has real, tangible consequences. Legal scholar Jeremy Waldron argues that hate speech undermines dignity and creates an environment where individuals feel unsafe and excluded. Think about what it means to constantly hear messages that target your identity, your race, your religion, your gender. Over time, that does not just offend, it wears people down. It could affect mental health, create anxiety, and make people feel like they do not belong in their own communities. It could also discourage participation. If people feel targeted or unwelcomed, they may choose not to speak at all. They may withdraw from conversations, classrooms, or public spaces, and that has consequences for democracy. Because a society where some voices are silenced, not by law, but by fear, is not fully free. Hate speech also contributes to the normalization of prejudice. When harmful ideas are expressed repeatedly, they can start to feel more acceptable. Over time, this can reinforce discrimination and deepen divisions within society. There's also concern about its connection to violence. Even if it does not meet the legal standard set in Brandenburg versus Ohio, it could still influence attitudes and increase hostility towards certain groups. So while the law does draw a clear line, the real world effects are far more complex. These harms lead directly into broader ethical concerns about whether this kind of speech should be protected at all.
There are ethical and democratic reasons to restrict hate speech. From an ethical perspective, many argue that free speech should not come at the expense of protecting vulnerable communities. They believe that the government has a responsibility not only to protect physical safety, but also to protect individuals from sustained harm to their dignity and equality. In this view, allowing hate speech prioritizes abstract freedom over real human consequences. Some democratic countries have chosen to restrict hate speech and attempting to balance freedom of expression with protections against harm. And this raises a very important question. Is the United States too extreme to its commitment to unrestricted speech? Another concern is the impact on public discourse. If individuals feel targeted, unsafe, or marginalized, they may choose to not participate in discussions at all. And when people withdraw, the diversity of perspectives decreases. And that weakens the foundation of very democracy in itself. Because democracy depends on participation, not just the ability to speak, but the willingness to speak. And so the issue becomes a balancing act. How do we protect free speech while also protecting people? And that brings us to our very central question of this debate.
With this discussion, we have examined both sides of whether hate speech should be protected under the First Amendment. We began with the legal foundation, including Brandenburg versus Ohio, which protects speech unless it directly incites imminent violence. We explored arguments in favor of protection, especially the importance of preventing government overreach and preserving free expression. At the same time, we acknowledge serious harms. Hate speech can affect mental health, reinforce discrimination, and discourage participation in public discourse. We also considered ethical concerns about protecting speech that harms vulnerable communities. But ultimately, restricting hate speech would require giving the government the power to define and limit expression, and that power carries significant risks. So, in the end, the question is not whether hate speech is harmful, because it clearly is. The real question is who should have the power to decide what speech is too harmful to exist? Because once that power is given, it rarely remains limited. And if it expands, as history suggests it often does, then the freedoms we rely on today may not exist tomorrow. A society that truly values freedom must be willing to protect speech, even if it finds that speech to be the most offensive. Because the moment protection disappears, all speech becomes vulnerable. And thank you, everyone. And here are our emails for any questions. Thank you.